Hello, welcome. Good evening, good afternoon, or good morning to all of you based on where you're joining. Thank you for joining us for what is the last session, but a keynote session for our conference that we've been convening for the last few days, entitled Iraq, Navigating Reform, Collapse, and the Status Quo. Before we begin, like usual, I'm going to go through some of the housekeeping items to get through that so we can go on to the conversation. Although Chatham House is known for a rule, this conversation will be on the record and public. The problem with chairing more than one panel, of course, is I make the same jokes, and those who have been watching more will probably get tired of hearing the same jokes that I make. The second point to make is that there is simultaneous translation between Arabic and English. إذا واحد يعني يريد يعني يحكي بالعربي يقدر ينقر على رابط إذا يريد يسمع بالعربي أكو رابط تحت الشاشة. And next year we will also be having Kurdish, hopefully, as well as part of our Iraq initiative as we move on. And to please submit questions in the Q&A function on Zoom. And I will go through the questions as we go through the conversation over the next 58 minutes now. So it's an absolute honor. My name again is Renad Mansour, a Senior Research Fellow and Project Director of the Iraq Initiative, and it is an absolute honor and privilege to welcome, albeit virtually, KRG, Kurdistan Regional Government's Deputy Prime Minister Qubad Talabani. A man, of course, who needs no introduction to many watching, having served in this position since June 2014, and prior to that, known to many as because of his role in the United States as the KRG's representative there since 2006. And I think for the purpose of this conference, the reason why we wanted to invite Qubad to speak is because he has really been one of the key voices challenging the systems and calling for reform in the KRG. The discussion today won't just be about the KRG, although of course that will come in. It'll be more about the challenges across the country as well. We heard at the beginning of our conference, Ali Alawi, the Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister, talk about some of the real challenges that his government is facing, and hopefully we can continue that. Throughout this conference, we have gone through the issues of youth in the country. We've gone through issues of security sector reform, cultural heritage, law, Iraq in the region, and then in the one this morning, we had on the challenges of economics. And what we've realized is that the connecting thread through all of this conversation has been the title of our conference, which is, where is Iraq going? It seems to be on the brink of collapse if you look at economic indicators, if you look at the many challenges. 2020 has not been a successful year. We're no longer talking about a post-conflict Iraq as we were when we had our conference last year entitled Iraq in Transition. So as part of our Iraq initiative, we decided to convene this conference to really reach out and have these conversations, taking advantage of the online sort of space to be able to bring all policymakers, officials, and activists together to discuss the issue of reform, the obstacles of liquidity, the extent to which, as we discussed in the previous panel, Iraq is spending deficit, going more and more into deficit, how long that could go on. How much will the political parties that benefit from the system continue to benefit as part of that? And we discussed the vested interests of political parties. Now, with that introduction, I wanted to, because we have less than an hour now, I wanted to get straight to it and ask Deputy Prime Minister an initial question, which is, you have been a vocal speaker on the need for reform in the KRG. You have been, you have pushed forward certain programs, using technology, using different types of investment, attracting foreign investment. How do you view this year as we near the end of this year of 2020? Is Iraq and the KRG included there on the brink of collapse? Is reform possible, or is that status quo that we've been seeing really being able to muddle through?
Well, thank you, Renad. Thank you for this opportunity. It's a pleasure to be with you, albeit virtually, and a big warm greetings to the viewers and participants, and a thank you for the conference and for the panelists that have spoken before me. I think if I would look at your title and be constructively critical, I would say that there's a word is redundant in these three words: reform, collapse, status quo, because status quo will lead to collapse. If the status quo continues, it will lead to collapse. So really the choice facing Iraq as a whole and the KRG within it is either reform or collapse. And I think that's the predicament, the challenge that is before us all, be it at a federal level or at the regional level. We, having survived and having been in the previous cabinet of the KRG in 2014, when we were faced with the multiple shocks to our system, the shock of our budget transfers being cut by the federal government, the war against ISIS, an influx of about 1.8 million refugees and IDPs, huge decline in oil prices towards the end of 2014 and 15. These were multiple shocks that hit our system. It was a big wake-up call to us back then that the status quo is untenable, that we needed to act fast on some tangible reforms that would result in better management of meager resources, but also look to find ways to generate more resources. Fast forward 6 years, we're facing similar challenges in this, sure, not post-conflict, but I would say mid to post-COVID climate, which is a conflict in and of itself, where again, oil prices have decreased, demands for increased public spending are high, the deficit is huge, investment climate, trade climate is not the best that it could be. So these are different kinds of shocks to our system. Again, when I talk about our system, I mean Iraq as a whole, but also specifically the KRG. So this is the challenge that we face. We face reform or collapse. We've picked reform. We're carrying out the reforms that we started back in 2014, but we're also introducing new reforms that we've introduced in this cabinet. But reform is not a magic pill. It is not something like a light switch that you can turn on or off. It is usually a painful process, a difficult one, especially when you have a complex political environment, when you have an unstable security environment, starting to hit people's, let's say, political interests, let's say illegal financial interests. When you start to do what you need to do, you start upsetting people along the way. And then that's when you get faced with the obstacles, you get faced with the challenges that require a degree of bravery to borrow through and to continue. So the challenge is there, and I think it's up to us to accept that challenge and to move ahead, move forward.
Thank you. And just picking up, I mean, it's great to hear you sort of say that reform is needed. And that many of the initial comments you made have been really at the core of our last 3 days during our conference, particularly this sort of hitting political interests. And if we can just, if I can push you a bit more on that question of, okay, we've seen in the central government, the white paper, we've heard you in the past on reform. We know what the wish list is, but what is the strategy? What do you think would be the best strategy, both short-term tactics, to then convince these political parties that they need to take cuts, basically, and that their interest would be hit?
So, I mean, you look at the strategy has to be one where, first and foremost, you have to address the bleeding. There is enormous spending and declining resources. So somehow that deficit needs to be plugged. Now, reform obviously is a part of that, but first thing must come austerity. We have to institute an austerity policy. We've done that. We did that in 2014 and 15 in the KRG, and we're doing that again today to try to cut our expenses as much as we can, to be able to use the resources that we do have in a more strategic way. But you look at any sovereign country, and this is where the KRG situation is a little different, being a sub-sovereign. As a sovereign country, you really have 5 tools at your disposal to manage an economic crisis. You have monetary policy, you have debt policy, you have the ability to reach out to international organizations for bailout programs, whether it's the IMF or World Bank. You have fiscal adjustments, and then you have reform. Now, in the KRG, to be honest, the only two of those 5 levers are at our disposal, which is the reform and the fiscal adjustments, whereas the federal government actually has a much broader set of tools at its disposal to manage the crisis that they're facing. Now, obviously, the big obstacle is not written among any of these, and that's the political climate. Pushing through reforms, first of all, austerity, which means cutting spending, and Iraq is not does not have massive overheads in terms of financing projects or financing kind of capital expenditures that could easily be dialed back. The big chunk of the spending goes towards the public sector, the salaries, the civil servants, the pensions, the social security benefits, the martyrs, the political prisoners. There is a whole array of wage earners that Iraq has to pay on a monthly basis. Again, this is exactly the case in the Kurdistan region. So, yes, we've cut the spending, the petty cash to each ministry by a significant amount. We've cut the ability of every ministry in our cabinet to do kind of their daily projects and the maintenance and the ribbon cutting ceremonies. We've thrown most of that out of the window, but that hasn't put a real dent in our expenditure, because a big chunk of our expenditure is in salaries, and that is the case in the federal government as well. So when you start talking about cutting salaries, this is when you start clashing with your own public, and that's where the political grandstanding comes in, and every political party wants to be the defender of the public. So on one hand, they're calling for reform, they're calling for better management of their revenues, they're calling for better management of public financing, but they say, oh no, but you can't touch salaries. Well, the reality is, in this climate when Iraq has practically a single source economy, and that economy is based on a commodity that its price has devalued dramatically, then you've got, you have a, did I lose you?
No, you're still there.
Yeah, when that commodity is devalued in the way that it is, then you've got this massive deficit. So, okay, you can't cut salaries, but then what do you do? So then you go down this list. Okay, so what else can we do? Can we try to increase revenues? What is Iraq's performance on collection of electricity tariffs, on collection of water tariffs, on collection of customs tariffs, on municipal fees? Now, Dutch disease is what Iraq is facing right now. It should be called Iraq disease or KRG disease now, where because you had a revenue based on oil which was coming in, the system gets lazy. The system gets lazy in collecting these non-oil revenues. Taxes, for example, countries live on taxes, countries flourish on taxes, but Iraq doesn't flourish on taxes because it's just had a lazy tax collection process, because there has always been this oil revenue. So that's when you can start coming into, okay, let me put aside the complicated, controversial stuff first. Let me start working on this, these fiscal adjustments, making yourself more robust in collecting revenues, in making tariffs more realistic, making municipal fees more realistic. So I think this is where it's somewhat less controversial. It can be done. It's not impossible. It just requires a degree of knowledge, a degree of focus, maybe a little bit of assistance from the international community, with experts, from economists and other experts that have lived through these kind of crises in other countries. But there is going to come a time where you're going to need to tackle the big ticket issues, the big expenditures, and ask yourself the question, does Iraq need the number of employees that it has on the current payroll? Are all of those employees actual employees, or how many of them are ghost employees? These multitude of allowances that people get on top of their base salaries, are they fair? Are they encouraging employment? What are we doing to the private sector by making the government this kind of huge octopus that is everywhere, that has its branches and tentacles in every segment of society? Are we strangling the private sector? What are we doing to encourage graduates from universities to not look for a job in the government, but look for a job in the private sector, or to promote entrepreneurship? So these are the, when I'm looking at our reform strategy, yes, I look at, austerity is a given. Before I even tackle the reform, austerity is a given. I have the fiscal adjustments, which is to increase more revenues and cut more expenditures. And then I have the reforms, which is focusing on diversifying our economy, trying to divert investment into agriculture, divert investment into industrial development, divert investment into tourism, which was, again, easier in a post-COVID world than it is right now. But you plant these seeds for reform now, maybe in 6 months, in a year, you start breaking away from the status quo and you start reaping the long-term benefits of this. But again, it has to be a coordinated strategy which has some degree of political will pushing it, which is, again, not easy in an election year, especially an election year in Iraq.
And just on that, I just thank you those who have been asking questions, and remind everybody to continue typing in their questions, and I will feed the questions to the Deputy Prime Minister throughout the course of this conversation. But just on that last point, Mr. Deputy Prime Minister, it is an election year, and the way that politics in Iraq works, as we've discussed over the last 3 years, is through patronage. And so you've discussed how do you garner political will from the elite, but how do you then convince the citizens who are receiving salaries that austerity is needed, especially when those salaries are part of the patronage networks that the political parties all benefit from?
The challenge we have collectively is convincing our public that there aren't enough resources. The reality is Iraq will always be viewed, even by the international donor community, as an oil-rich country. So trying to convince people that Iraq needs money, being an oil-rich country, is in and of itself a difficult task. And then you look at the gaps in the system. You look at the customs revenues that come into the federal treasury. You look at some of the other revenues that come into the federal treasury, and you start to see that, hang on, this could be improved and increased drastically without it having a massive, painful effect on the society. When you show that you're actually tackling reforms cross-sectorally, and you're doing things that may hurt some of the interests of the big, let's say, political parties and movements, then I think your public will be much more amenable to kind of partnering with you in taking some of the pain. But if you don't do any of the reforms, you don't tackle any of the big interests, you don't stop any of the bleeding, you don't tackle even some of the big corruption issues, and the people are going to say, well, why should we have to tax this? Why should we be taxed for your incompetence on tackling some of the things that you should be doing? And this is again where you have to balance between, okay, all right, sorry, you guys, you parties, and we're doing this now. So in terms of in the KRG, we implemented a biometric registration program. We've registered every wage earner in the system, And in our first skim of the system, we found 16,500 people who have been illegally receiving 2 salaries. Boom, I'm cutting those salaries. You know, that's illegal. That, I don't care whose party these people belong to, any political party that is against me cutting somebody's illegal salary, I'd like them to please come on TV and tell me that I've done something bad. Like, you do a couple of things like this, you start to, people will start looking at you and thinking, well, okay, well, this is serious. They're going after some of the big things, you know, and we have to be realistic. We can't, nobody can tackle all of the faults and flaws of the system, but you've got to start somewhere. And I think we're trying to reconnect and rebuild trust with our public, with our constituents, by saying, look, we understand the problem. We have a vision for how we're going to fix this problem. This is what we as the government are going to do to tackle this problem. But eventually there's going to come a time when, you know, and to be fair, our public has been very, very patient. They have been more than patient. We have fallen behind many months in paying their salaries. So, you know, asking for their patience is something that's, you know, very difficult for us to do. But I think now Iraq, for the first time, is facing the kinds of problems that we faced really, I would say, 6 years ago.
Thank you. One of the events that we were able to do at Chatham House this year was with the Prime Minister, Mustafa al-Kadhimi, who touched on a few issues, including Baghdad-Erbil relations. And I was wondering, as we kind of zoom out a bit now to the whole of the country, your perspective on the reform efforts by the current administration in Baghdad, and this kind of age-old question, the age-old negotiations on the relationship between KRG and the government, this federal government, how those are going based on your sort of interactions and the work that you've done in those negotiations.
Well, really, since the, you know, despite all of the challenges and the setbacks and the sometimes disagreements that we have a good working relationship with the Mustafa Kadhimi and his cabinet, the finance minister. He's leading the negotiations on the federal government side, and I've been tasked to lead the negotiations on the KRG side. So I think when you speak to each other as a government to government, there is logic in the discussions, there is an understanding of the macro problems, and there is an understanding of what is reasonable to attain in this interim period. Now, our problem is this: we're not in a world where it's just a government to government. You know, these governments, yes, they're made up of political parties, but then we have the parliament, and that, you know, we saw what happened, for example, with this recently passed so-called debt law, which was more of a, you know, a temporary budget law really than a debt law. But what we agreed to with the federal government, the language we agreed to with the federal government was acceptable to both the federal government and the regional government. But by the time it went into the parliament and went into the finance committee, and then everybody, all of the parties had their say, and they were cutting this section of it and adding that section of it, the output, the product, the final bill that was passed looked barely anything like what was reached upon between the federal government and the regional government. So these are the kinds of setbacks where you look at trying to solve a problem logically in a very illogical political climate, again, with the cloud of an election year, where regrettably, it is now popular to have an anti-Kurdish, anti-KRG position. This is a platform that is gaining traction among the various political parties in the rest of the country. And if this builds up momentum, then, you know, this is not going to get us closer to, you know, global reform. This is not going to get us close to reaching deals on oil management, on revenue sharing, on settling the debt issues. We somehow need to incubate ourselves in dealing with the issues from a logical and legal and purely kind of operational perspective. But in the fog of politics, it's proving to be very, very difficult.
Great. I'm just going to begin putting up a few of the questions that have been asked. Mibin Matthew Merman has asked, how has the current withdrawal of US troops from the Kurdistan region, how will that affect the stability of the Kurdistan region? Hussein Chalabi is asking, with salaries and number of employees being the main expense, one would expect that numbers of employees via efficient institutions. Salaries of employees put payment basis productivity. Where is the slack to do it in that question? And finally, from Judith, a question: if you have to convince the people that austerity is needed, how can you do this when people feel the problems are caused by the stealing by politicians and the corruption of the elites? So, you know, if you could kind of address these questions and in your next comments, please, Mr. Deputy Prime Minister.
Sure. I'll start with the easy one about the troops and security. I don't see a complete withdrawal of US forces for many years to come. I think that there will always be a security relationship between Iraq and the United States, and with that, the Kurdistan region. So I don't think the number and the size of the US troop presence is really an issue. I think if we have one US soldier in the KRG, then you have US security interests in the KRG. So I think we're not so, we obviously have an opinion on that. We think Iraq, at this stage, especially as it's continuing to go through this transition, requires the assistance of the coalition forces, both to continue the fight against ISIS, but also to continue to stand up and organize a legitimate and disciplined and effective security infrastructure throughout the country. And I think what a lot of people, sometimes a lot of parties here don't understand is a lot of the diplomatic and reform and economic assistance that is provided by the international community to Iraq is under the umbrella of the protection of the coalition forces. So you take this protection umbrella away, I think you will make it much more difficult for diplomatic missions to operate. You'll make it much more difficult for foreign assistance to be actually effectively delivered. So for us, the presence is not so much about the size, but their continued engagement is vital. To Mr. Chalabi's question regarding salaries, number of employees, where is the slack? I think before you look at the slack, you have to find where is the excess. You know, what we're doing now, for example, it's a cumbersome procedure, but it's quite a simple, logical one. We've asked every ministry to just give me your organizational chart. Right? I want to know how many departments every ministry has, both at the ministry level, but at a provincial level, at a district level, and a sub-district level, and how many staff is assigned to each department. You create an organizational chart of every ministry. We have the biometric registration, which is registered every employee, and then you marry them up, and then you'll suddenly see that Ministry X has 5,000 extra staff. Ministry Y may have 10,000 extra staff. You can't just fire this extra staff immediately, because then you'll probably end up having 100,000 people fired, which will be 100,000 demonstrators on your streets. But then you can at least, again, understand the size of your problem. And there are all kinds of clever ways to right-size your government, been worked on all over the world through basic human resources management. Now, I'm a believer of always making big problems smaller into smaller pieces. So that's where you'll find where the slack is. Maybe you can easily pass a law that will allow people to have early retirement. Okay, so if you can retire 30% of your excess workforce, not of the entire workforce, but of the excess workforce, you convince them that, okay, go home, here's a retirement bill. You may not get 100% of your salary for now, but Iraq's retirement law is quite lenient. You send people home, you're cutting your expenditure. You're making a problem which is already big, somewhat smaller. The next step, you can do initiatives where you put people into the private sector. Again, you can say, look, I'll give you 50% of your pay. Leave me, get a job in the private sector. I'll give you 50% of your pay for the next 5 years. I still win because I still will spend 50% less for those people, for the next 5 years, and after 5 years, they're on their own. So that's where I think it's about being strategic. It's about being methodical in finding out where that slack is and where you can actually begin to make the necessary cuts. The third question is probably more challenging because there's less logic involved in it. It's more emotion, right? It's easier to deal with logical issues because 1 + 1 will always equal 2. But in terms of politics and media and social media and perceptions, there isn't always logic in them. So that when there is a perception that X is corrupt, that the system is corrupt, then no amount of logic and reasoning will be able to dispel that. And this is where I think by building a track record of delivery, you actually make a promise, make a small promise, deliver on it, you build some track record, you build a bit of credibility. Eventually people will realize that, hang on, there is real efforts to reform the system here. So you know what, I'm going to cut them some slack here. So much of the anti-corruption measures over the last 15 years in Iraq has been about punishing corrupt people, but I think 80% of the corruption could have been avoided if your processes were more transparent, were less, the bureaucracy was less, you needed less approvals to approve something. So just by closing the door on the petty corruption, again, it's about generating that trust and better will with the public.
Yeah, thank you for that. Some of the work that we're looking to do as well is moving away from the focus on personal corruption and towards the political corruption, right? Which is really at the heart of the discussions and the roots of that allow the petty corruption. So it's really good to hear your take on that. I will take a few more questions at the moment. So Mina Al-Oraibi is asking, Iraq is a rich country. The problem is mismanagement and corruption, not lack of resources, as you've outlined. Iraqi politicians have been promising reforms for years, in addition to tackling ghost salaries. What other measures have the KRG and Iraq undertaken that you would say are successful in curbing corruption? And I think I would echo Mina's points that as on our side, as analysts, we often hear from yourself as well as from the Deputy Prime Minister who spoke in the initial keynote, we're all on the same page in understanding the problems and that. But how you in the positions that you hold, are you, and this will be a question I ask you, do you feel that you are sat in a seat of power? Are you sat where decisions are made? Are decisions made in those institutions, or can sometimes they come from outside those institutions? So I'm just adding a question to that because of my interest. But I also wanted to add a question from Simona Fulton, who asks about, in your view, what is the solution to the long-lasting dispute over revenue sharing budget between the KRG and the federal government? What revenue sharing mechanism is the KRG willing to commit to in exchange for their budget share? So those are two different sets of questions, and I'll allow you to kind of address them both, separately, obviously.
Sure, thank you, and a big hello to Mina, and thank you for the question. So ghost employees is one thing. We've started on this process, and we're tackling it. But I think as damaging as ghost, actually more damaging than ghost employees are employees that aren't ghosts, but aren't doing anything, right? They're just excess, right? Because the ghost, at least, there's a fiscal pain to somebody getting paid who doesn't exist. But there is a bureaucratic pain to somebody who is paid, but is just some political hack that is being paid a salary to just turn up and do nothing and just spread gossip in the office, obstruct real reform. So actually this is more difficult to tackle, because the ghost employee, you can at the end of the day just cut their salaries, and somebody who is illegally benefiting from that salary no longer benefits from it. But the right sizing of the government, and this goes back to the right sizing the government, is I would say, is equally as important to the issue of ghost salaries. I think there is a huge mismanagement in pensions. I think a lot of people have been pensioned off in the federal government and in the regional government who have never had a job for the government, who never served in the military, but because they were have some sort of political connection, they've benefited over the last 15, 20, maybe even more years from a salary that is illegal. I think you can go full on and not just cut that salary, but ask for all of that money back. Realistically, you cut that salary, you stop the bleeding, and you kind of draw a line and move on from it. Might be more realistic. Another thing that I think is a source of much frustration to the public is just government performance as a whole. So people are upset, right? Electricity is bad, the salaries are delayed, all of the political noise and the security noise creates an already tense environment. You add to that, just going into the vehicle registration office or the driver's license bureau and asking to renew your driver's license, for example, and it's just a painful process where you get strung through the ringer, going to see 20 different people. Just for example, in the KRG right now, if you wanted to renew your driver's license, it takes 17 steps to renew your driver's license. Not to get issued a driver's license, but just to renew a license that you already have. You have to see 17 different windows. Yeah, why? Why on earth do you need to see 17 different windows? Because you've got all of these extra employees you've got to give some sort of job to. So what we're doing to tackle this issue is we've process mapped every service that the government is providing our public citizens. I'm not talking about the general services such as water and electricity and security. These are broad services. I'm talking about individual transactions. We've process mapped every single one of them. We have about 407 individual transactions between the government and the public. And we've asked every one of our ministers to streamline those processes, to make those processes be delivered easier, faster, and cheaper. And this is, again, it's not window dressing. It just relieves a little bit of that frustration that our citizens have. So, and I lived in the US for a long time, and I used to hate going into the DMV to renew my driver's license in the US until I moved to another state where the process was so nice, it was clean, it was automatic, and it happened. And I was like, wow, this was a great experience, right? I want my citizens to have that experience. Like when they go into an office, they're greeted respectfully in a clean building with basic services such as water and a little bit of hospitality, and then an easy interaction, an easy transaction. This all builds trust. This makes people think, okay, this government is actually serving me. It's not serving some political bigwig who's in the back counting the money or in the back, handing out contracts or whatever. This government is serving me. So we have this program, in parallel with our pension reform, in parallel with our ghost employee and government restructuring. Peshmerga reform is a big deal. There's probably a lot of excess spending in our security services. Plus, I don't think the base salary across the payroll scale isn't a problem, but all of these allowances are a huge problem. And I hate to get kind of nerdy and into the details with you, but really sometimes we have to. We have in KRG we have about 24 different allowances that get added to your base salary depending on a whole host of different parameters, whether you have a degree or not, whether you live far away from your place of work. Some of them make sense, right? Some of them don't make sense, right? For example, in education, we're supposed to give 150,000 dinars to every teacher. Okay, but what's ended up happening is we've given 150,000 dinars to every employee of the Ministry of Education. And we're thinking, well, okay, well, why? Well, for example, now an accountant at the Ministry of Education will get 150,000 dinars more than an accountant in another ministry because they don't have this special allowance that was earmarked specifically for the Ministry of Education. So there are these kinds of technical things that we can really again, but this is what requires the political will, because this generates the political noise, that generates the different interest groups, the unions and the associations that will all come out onto the streets and cause noise. But you have to tackle them. You know, we have dozens of unions that do absolutely nothing, that are just basically blocking certain reforms, and they're empowered by the laws to do so. So that's we're tackling those. Promoting private sector, it's easy to say, right? It's a nice slogan, we support the private sector, but what are we doing to make it easier for the private sector to thrive? So company registration, for example, this is a huge problem in KRG. I'm not sure how difficult or easy it is in Baghdad, but in the KRG, it takes 26 days to set up a company. You go to Dubai, you set up a company in 2 hours. Why should it take 26 days to set up a company? Why should our Chamber of Commerce have to approve the name of the company you wish to choose? Well, I'll tell you why. It's enshrined in the law. So we need to change that law. I have a lot of respect for the Chambers of Commerce, but they shouldn't tell a person what name they should name their company. Okay? So we have tasked our team to, okay, 2 hours may be extreme. Give me 24 hours. From 26 days to 24 hours. I want a company to be able to register in 24 hours. It's doable. Right? Make it easier for companies to do business. They will do business. You don't kill them with regulation and multiple fees and multiple taxes and multiple kind of death by 1,000 cuts. Tax them once, big time at the end of the year. Let them work. Help them work. So these are the different strands of reforms that we're working on. A big one that we are launching is electricity. Electricity sector is a critical service, right? In Kurdistan, if you break up electricity into the three main headings: generation, transmission, and distribution. Right now, the private sector in Kurdistan generates the power. But transmission and distribution, and obviously collection of revenues, is done by the public sector. We are now entering into agreements with the private sector to distribute power. So we'll have power companies, utility companies in Kurdistan that will be in charge of delivering the power that is generated by the private sector to the homes, which means that they are also in charge of collecting the revenues. Okay, everyone has most 90% of people in Kurdistan have a mobile phone. You don't pay for your mobile phone, you can't use it. But in the government, because they're paying the government for the electricity, one, we're a bit shy in collecting electricity revenues because we don't want to upset our public, and we want to be nice. Second time, people are saying, well, government is this, government is that, and they're not paying for the electricity. So we think the private sector will do a much better job, both at delivering the service, but also at collecting the revenue. So again, all of this will make our government more flexible, more streamlined, and more effective.
Mm-hmm. I just wanted to just flag that Simona and if you could perhaps address this question, because there was a kind of an add-on.
Yes.
Yeah, it's sort of what in your.
I wasn't avoiding it. I promise you. I just got too into the weeds of the other.
No, I know.
Yeah,
and thank you for nerding out. We very much appreciate. Some of us appreciate the nerding out. But if you wanted to just briefly touch on what will a deal look like? What could a good deal look like?
I tell you that, again, you look at this logically, it really it shouldn't be as complicated as it is. We have a resource, a revenue, a resource called oil. Iraq has a resource called oil. We've spent so many years trying to fix the issue of the management of the oil sector that we've wasted many, many years finding a formula to distribute those revenues. I'm happy to say that the complex, let's say the complex that officials in the Iraqi Federal Oil Ministry used to have regarding KRG's oil regime, with the production sharing contracts and the contracts we used to have, that complex doesn't seem to exist anymore. There is an understanding that KRG is different geographically, topographically, and to develop oil in Kurdistan necessitates the production sharing agreements rather than the service contracts that exist in the rest of the country. So we're past the days of my good old friend, Dr. Shahristani, who used to say, anytime something about Kurdistan used to come up, he used to say illegal, right? That's no longer the case anymore. Now the case is, okay, where's the revenue? All of our discussions over the last 8-9 months with the federal government has been more geared towards revenue sharing than, sometimes they call it, well, handing over oil, right? So we're saying, okay, we have no problems handing over oil, but our oil comes at a cost. Are you willing to take on that cost? Are you, as the federal government, willing to take on the cost to the producers? Are you willing to take on the costs for the pipeline, which is a privately operated pipeline? Are you willing to take on the costs for loading and unloading in Turkey? Are you willing to take on the costs that we have for the traders who sell our oil, because we don't sell directly to market? If you're willing to take on those costs, ahlan wa sahlan, here's the oil. So when they come to an understanding, okay, well, this is a different management model than the federal government. They're saying, okay, well, let's talk about revenues. And even in the finance and administration law, which governed most of 2020, it talks about revenue sharing. And even in the debt law, which was passed in November, the transfer of funds to KRG is conditional on handing over oil revenues. So this is, I think, we're getting towards the point where we can actually reach a deal on oil revenues. Now, practically, this isn't a case of me giving Iraq money and the federal government giving me back more. It's offset, right? This is Kurdistan's allocation per the federal budget. This much of this allocation will be filled through KRG's own sales. The rest will be topped up by the federal government. This is the model that works. Now, we can get into a sub-level of detail in terms of, okay, who markets the oil. So we have the state oil marketing organization, SOMO. We don't think SOMO is we respect it as an organization. We would be happy for a revised SOMO to have a new entity where there is KRG members on this board, so we have visibility on what the oil sale process across the country. We've expressed that we're more than willing to entertain the idea of a restructured SOMO that could then do all of the oil sales. But until then, we have our oil process completely audited by Deloitte and Ernst & Young, and we get monthly reports and seasonal reports that we are now sharing with the federal government, which give them precise data on output, on sales, on revenues, on how much of those revenues go towards debt, go towards servicing the oil companies, goes towards financing KRG operations. This isn't Qubad speaking anymore. This isn't our Ministry of Finance. This isn't our Ministry of Oil. These are reputable companies that probably make much more money than we do in the KRG, who are not going to tarnish their names to be part of a political haggle between KRG and Baghdad. So it's not impossible. What we've always had a problem with in the past is, okay, before they used to say, the federal government used to tell us, well, you've got to take care of, you give me all of the oil and I'll give you your money, but then you've got to take care of the IOCs out of your money. We've moved beyond this. Now there is an understanding that our oil has a cost, which is, I think, a big step forward. We've moved, to a new level where we have contracts that the federal government feels, okay, these are realities that they can't undo. Where we have a problem, I think, is still on debt. The KRG is in debt because of the cut of the fiscal transfers in 2014. We are heavily in debt, but then Iraq is heavily in debt. So we are trying to find a way to put all of this debt together, rather than say, well, it's your fault or it's my fault or it's so fault. The reality is Iraq is in debt and KRG is in debt. We have been contributing to Iraq's debt through Iraq's repayment of these debts through the sovereign expenditures. As KRG, it comes out of our pot, comes out of our resources. So we're saying, look, let's put the debt together. If we clear some of our oil trading debts, then we are less restricted on who we sell to, which means SOMO can have a much greater role in marketing KRG oil. And then we would like a greater role in being part of that process to market the oil, which actually would mean better rates for our oil, because you lose a lot of the fees and maybe some of the insurance costs and some of the uncertainty costs that go along with the procurement of KRG oil. So there is a model. It's purely revenue sharing. It's based on reality that we have as KRG set expenditures. We can't do anything about. We're trying to make them less. Yep, Iraq is trying to make theirs less. But it's not fair to say, well, the KRG is taking Baghdad's pot and it's taking their own money. We get this accusation labeled at us all the time. KRG's oil production is 9% of the country's total production, yet we're only getting 5% of the country's total budget. So it's not fair. We're not having our cake and eat it. We just want a fair deal that is sustainable in this climate.
Mm-hmm. We have a few minutes left. I'm going to take a couple of questions. Looking at sort of the region, the disputed areas, the borders, Jacob Erickson has asked, how would you assess the efficacy of the new security coordination centers between the Peshmerga and the Iraqi security forces to provide security in the disputed territories? And a second question, Ina Rudolph asks, how realistic do you regard the implementation of automated border control across Iraq, and how can resistance from informal actors be managed by organs of the state? Of course, this is something that the finance minister of Iraq, Ali Alawi, also has focused on, these customs, and I know that there have been at times debates on what happens to customs revenue. He has said that Iraq expects about $8 or $9 billion and gets less than $1 per year. So your thoughts on those questions, and then concluding thoughts as well, as we only have a few minutes left.
So I think that we are really at the infancy of security coordination in the disputed territories, and while there are talks, and occasionally there may be even joint operations, I don't think we're at a point where we can say that we are happy with the level of coordination that exists between the KRG forces and the Iraqi security forces. And this lack of robust coordination, especially in places like Kirkuk and in and around the Nineveh area and some parts of Diyala, gives room for ISIS to maneuver, to navigate, and to cause problems and actually launch attacks, which they have done. So I think that we need to get over some of the political sensitivities about who is where and whose forces are where, and realize that beyond politics there is a definite and immediate threat to the citizens of those areas from ISIS and from other groups that may be offshoots of ISIS. So that needs to be stepped up. We have had some joint security operations that have been very successful, but it needs to be more robust. It needs to be more strategic. And again, a few joint operations, a few joint patrols. Again, you start to build trust, and then you start beginning to integrate these forces in these areas. And these kinds of things have cause a world of goodwill and help reduce tensions. I think with border crossings, there needs to be more automation. There needs to be better data collection of the borders. In the KRG, we have begun implementing electronic documentation of things coming into and out of the KRG. We need to integrate them. We need to connect them to a central database, so our ministry has eyes on all the time with what's coming in, what's going out. We have problems there. There's no doubt about that. Iraq and KRG has been a trade route for thousands and thousands of years. So people always find a way to bring something in illegally. Addressing that, tackling that is always has always been a problem. Will continue to be a problem. But also setting customs policy, trade policy is something that where the region and the federal government can work on, I think, in greater level of unity. We want to protect local product without being completely and totally socialist about it. We want to have a nice mix where you encourage trade, but you also encourage no disrespect to total socialists out there, but our view is to have the private sector operate, to support local production, to support domestic production, but also create an environment where there is healthy competition with foreign imports. So that requires a subtle balance, but obviously you need more robust coordination. Iraq created, the federal government created this border agency, border board, this board to manage the borders. I don't think it's worked, right? Because there are about 15, 16 different government agencies that are on these international borders, from veterinary departments to health to planning to trade to customs to security, to a whole host of government agencies need to coordinate. So this border agency that was created, I think, during the Prime Minister Abadi's era, has caused administrative confusion between the ministries who have their own chains of commands to the minister, and then this new agency that's supposed to be headed up, I think, by the Ministry of Interior. So we don't necessarily want to replicate what they've done because they've caused a bit of chaos, but we do need to restructure how the borders are managed to make sure that they're being as effective as possible. Iraq cannot have a $1 billion border revenue. That's ridiculous. That's what a year. That's what KRG is getting. And that's so that's just that they need to amplify that significantly. And I think we can certainly make our borders more robust as well.
If I may ask a final question, and for a very your quick thought on it, your quick take on it. I was struck at the beginning, you began by saying Iraq is not going to, the status quo won't continue, and Iraq is on the brink of collapse. And you've kind of put yourself on that end of the debate. Since 2003, we've seen civil war, we've seen Al-Qaeda, we've seen the Mahdi army, we've seen ISIS, oil crisis of 2014, the referendum and the disputes in Kirkuk and other territories, the use of violence against protesters, and somehow that political system has kind of muddled through. So what, if it's in just in a few words, what are you looking at as the key indicator that leads you to conclude that Iraq is indeed on the verge of collapse?
The fact that the deficit, the size of the deficit. Iraq just passed a debt law, right? They in this debt law, they've authorized, I think, 26 trillion dinars in this debt law. I think 8 trillion of it has gone towards sovereign expenditures. The rest is going to go towards plugging the deficit for the next 3 months. That's October, November, and December. Well, that's what is that in dollars or pounds? That's a sizable amount of money that they've had to borrow just to plug 3 months worth of deficit. Okay, you can survive that for 3 months, but what are you going to do for the next 12 months of 2021? So the budget law that's going to be passed hopefully in January 2021, if it has a 60% deficit added to it, just is going to make it an unrealistic and unfeasible and untenable budget law. It's going to be an academic exercise. It's not going to reflect the reality. So how is the country going to plug a 60% deficit? That's, all of these other problems you mentioned, these are big issues. War is a painful issue. People, you lose lives, but sometimes wars unify a nation. Obviously some of the political clashes that have existed over the years through resistance, and then the various different movements and things, these have been political in nature. The state has always provided, in its own welfare state kind of way, the salaries on time, the pensions on time, the allowances on time, the social security benefits on time. So a huge percentage of the public that is benefiting from the state can muddle through all of these political and social and security crises. But when people start not getting paid this month, maybe they'll take a month, maybe they'll take two, maybe they'll take three, but eventually that public, anger will spill over into the streets. Now, the last round of demonstrations were criticizing the government for corruption and poor performance, but you add to that the demonstration of hungry people. That's when I think that's the danger that Iraq faces as a whole. The KRG, we're very much in tune with this. We're very much concerned about this, which is why we're trying to do everything we can. One, to reach a deal with Baghdad to address certainly our immediate issues, but also to expedite the reforms to make sure that we do not fall further behind in our obligations as a state to provide our citizens. So, that's what worries me, is this deficit is too big, and I don't see an uptick in oil prices big enough in a short enough period of time that is going to fill this deficit. And that's what I think politicians in Baghdad as a whole need to take a step back and take a step back from the political bickering and blaming it on the Kurds or the Shiites or the Sunnis or this Shiite and that Sunni, and say, look, we have a massive hole in the deficit and a massive weight that is on the Prime Minister's shoulders, on the Finance Minister's shoulders, and on our government's shoulders in the north to pay. And where are we going to get the money from?
Mm-hmm. Mr. Deputy Prime Minister Qubad, thank you very much. It's been a joy, as always, listening to your thoughts. We wish you all the best as one of the reformists in the KRG, as well as the others. Thank you to you again for your time. Thank you to everybody for watching online.
Renad,
Yes.
Sorry.
Sure.
Sorry. I just realized I sounded really pessimistic just on.
Yeah,
on
I was going to say.
I just want to add, just before everyone gets really depressed. That's why we're doing the reforms, and we're going to do the reforms, and that's why Iraq needs to step up the reforms. Because if you do those reforms now, if we start these reforms now, we can stop this decline and stop the bleeding. And I am optimistic. I'm an optimist. I've always been an optimist. I think that's genetically ingrained in me. So yes, it's bad, but it's not. Yeah. We're not going to collapse. We won't let it collapse.
Thank you. No, thank you, Qubad. Thank you. And we know we've been hearing your optimism, but also following the reforms that you have been sort of pursuing for the last few years. So thank you for that. And we hope to continue our conversations and welcome you in person at some point in the future to Chatham House again. And I wanted to thank everybody for tuning in. And for over the last 3 days, it's been great. We've had over 700 or 800 registrations for these 3 days, so it's been good. Thank you to the Iraq Initiative and to Crescent Petroleum, UCL, and the Swadis for really allowing us to do this work. Our goal, of course, is to keep Iraq and the KRG on the main page of not just Chatham House, but also in international and public circles. And it's been great to have a public audience to listen to what otherwise people associate Chatham House with, which is the kind of closed meetings under the rule. And finally, to thank Georgia, Rennie, Joey, and the team at Chatham House who have put this together. We were not sure whether it would be cool or if people are zoomed out and wouldn't what a 3-day conference on Zoom would actually look like and be like. But I think it's been a very good success. And so thanks to Chatham House's MENAP team. And again, once again, to all of you for joining us. We will continue the conversation and hope to invite speakers and participants like Deputy Prime Minister of the KRG, Qubad Talabani, and others back in the future. But that's all for now, and take care and bye-bye.